Good evening and welcome to this edition of Tok Piksa. Tonight we speak to the Special Parliamentary Committee on Public Sector Reform and Service Delivery. With me in the studio is Committee Chairman and Member for Goroka, Bire Kimisopa. Mr. Kimisopa, welcome to the show and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Neville. Thanks very much.
Okay. You are heading a Special Parliamentary Committee and it's on Public Sector Reform and Service Delivery. Now these two names traditionally in PNG don't actually associate with each other because we've seen a big gap between the public service and the actual service delivery to the people. What kind of work is your committee involved in?
Thank you, Neville. I think it's quite important. PNG has gone through 39 years of independence and a number of jurisdictions around the world. They've made enormous changes in the public service. In fact, their public service has become smaller, not bigger. We've taken the opposite trend. We've become bigger, not smaller, and it's costing the country a substantial amount of money. Now, Neville, if you were to look at the budget as it is in 2015, the actual appropriation for public service is roughly about 7 billion. Now, internal revenue should be around, including grants, perhaps probably about 10 billion. But almost 60 or 70% of the entire revenue is consumed by the public service. Now, the public service, when you're talking about public service, you've got to make a distinction. Now, public service, we're predominantly dealing with your Department of Health, Education, Police, Defense, Department of Works, all these line agencies of government. Now, we're not talking about the public sector. That's also an arm of government. They enjoy a certain degree of autonomy, and their expenditure or their appropriation is not featured in our budget. So if you look at the actual numbers, it's quite significant. So you're absolutely right. The gulf between policy announcement and policy implementation is growing bigger and bigger. And it has been the collective view of this Parliament, and that we need to set up a special parliamentary committee and start asking the big questions in this country. Why aren't we delivering services down to our people? And most recently, why are mothers delivering baby on the sidewalk when they should be in a maternity ward? Why aren't our people getting access to legal services? Why aren't cases on remand increasing right throughout the country, not having their day in court? Why are the civil courts being overburdened by election petitions that's running almost the entire length of Parliament, that judges and the National Registry are all bogged down trying to dispense with election petitions? So there's a whole range of issues out there. But I think the biggest problem, as we see after 39 years of independence now, is this: our people are starting to realize that they're not getting services they're entitled to, whether it's water supply in the village, whether it's better roads, access to the markets in towns and cities. You can go through the whole range of services provided by government that our people are not getting. So there's a whole heap of issues out there. Our social indicators have not improved over the last 20 years. And yet the economy is growing. Our GDP growth rates are quite impressive by comparable standards around the world. But in terms of mitigating some of our worst social indicators, we've done a poor job. So it's incumbent on Parliament that we start asking those big questions. And the establishment of the Special Parliamentary Committee has come about as a general consensus. That was at that time that we need to provide another pair of eyes, another pair of ears, so that we can add to the debate. Neville, it's so critical, it's so important that we ask these big questions. Now, the establishment of the Special Parliamentary Committee is a creature of Parliament. I report to Parliament. There are 6 parliamentarians that make up the committee. We've been designated with that huge responsibility, first and foremost to determine what is the road forward for us so that we can mitigate some of these big problems that we have in the country. Now, some people may ask this question: why are they doing this when there's so many committees, so many reports going on? But may I say this, Neville? Those committee reports that is already out there are driven by the public service themselves. This one is a special parliamentary committee. It's never been done before. Over the last 39 years, since the inception of Parliament, this is a unique opportunity for us as members of Parliament to be able to determine for ourselves that our people that we represent in Parliament getting what they rightfully deserve in terms of services. So it's a huge responsibility. It's a very ambitious project embarked by this Parliament, and Prime Minister Peter O'Neill and the opposition leader Belden Nama have unanimously endorsed in terms of the formation of a special parliamentary, overwhelmingly supported by every member of Parliament. It's a long road ahead, but I think we're certainly asking the right questions now.
What would be some of the key questions that you're asking with regards to the work you're doing?
Well, absolutely, Neville. First and foremost, because the approach we're taking is a root and branch approach. Right. So we think all powers emanate from Parliament, so we've got to start with Parliament. And Parliament being Parliament, we've got to do a comparative analysis across the region. Are the parliaments in Australia enjoying the same kind of privileges that the Parliament in PNG has? The Parliament in other jurisdictions enjoying the same kind of privileges, are enjoying the same kind of sanction and powers that they have, that we have in this country? I think the big question now is that we don't. Parliament, under our present constitution, there are certain powers that parliamentary committees, if you look at parliamentary committees in Parliament, they're not vested with the kind of powers, and they're not sanctioned with the authority to call people up by way of subpoena or by way of a formal request. Now, Parliament as it is, because we have the separation of functions, you got Parliament, the executive, and the judiciary. So more or less, we've shifted the responsibility of Parliament to the courts. Mm-hmm. Now, to begin the whole process of trying to restore integrity and powers of Parliament, what we are considering now is to, by legislation, so we will be on par with Australia and a number of other jurisdictions, is to legislate powers so that parliamentary committees have powers to be able to call people up and to be able to refer people for prosecution if there is misconduct in office, all range of issues. So Parliament should have all sanctions to be able to deliver punitive measures. So I guess it may be a long shot, but that's the way of making sure our people, and don't forget, Parliament is for the people, of the people, for the people. So essentially what we're trying to do is that restore the integrity of Parliament, restore the kind of powers that it should have. Now, in this country, the parliamentary committee that has substantial weight to be able to call witnesses, that's the Parliamentary Committee on Public Accounts. Now, the big question is, since when has anyone been referred to police for prosecution over the last 39 years, since the establishment of the Public Accounts Committee? Those powers are lacking, whereas comparable jurisdiction, for instance, in New Zealand and Australia, they have that. Now, if we are to bring a lot more debate and a lot more scrutiny in the process of making sure public officials are held accountable, then I think it makes it a lot more easier for our people if they are unhappy with the way we're dispensing public service. They have another avenue where they can lodge formal complaints to the respective parliamentary committees. And to begin with, if any parliamentary committee has a power to prosecute or refer people for prosecution for maladministration, corruption, misuse of public funds, I think we ought to have that. Mm-hmm. We ought to have that. Now, lacking that, and empirical evidence seems to suggest that no one has gone to jail yet. No one has been punished severely for maladministration, corruption, and so forth. We've got a lot of work on our plate. So, Neville, initially what we are proposing to do is look at the constitutional provisions that should empower contempt of Parliament. Right. So we can have that enacted in law, that Parliament becomes a Parliament for what it is. Then you have the public service and the public sector. And not only do they have to respond to oversight agencies in this country, whether it's the Ombudsman Commission, whether it's the Frauds Court, whether it's the Auditor General who can make certain referrals and so forth, they also have to deal with the Parliament, which is the people's house. And I think if we can start there, I think we'll save ourselves a lot of problems in the future.
So contempt for Parliament, meaning that if, say, a department secretary doesn't get a job done, the minister can hold him accountable? No,
Neville, what we're saying is a contempt for Parliament insofar as the parliamentary committees are concerned. Okay. They can call someone up. Now, he's under oath. Mm-hmm. If he's, for instance, if he's Secretary for Department of Works. Right. Now, if the prevailing construction rate for 1 kilometer of Seal Road is roughly about 1.5 million kina, why is it that it's now 10 million kina? And if Parliament is of the view, and it has credible information that through the tendering process, that the standards have not been applied, and for some reason, a contract has been awarded. Now, the standards are asking for 1.5 million kina per kilometer. All of a sudden, it's been jacked up to about 10 million kina. So we've got to ask this critical question. So, was the procurement process transparent? Mm-hmm. And if there's any instances of corruption, then the Works Parliamentary Committee ought to refer the Secretary for Prosecution, make that recommendation. And that is carried. Or alternatively, if the Secretary for Work stands up in a special parliamentary committee, he's been subpoenaed to give evidence, and he gives misleading evidence, then he ought to be jailed. Misleading or false information. So the issue of running public institutions, it becomes a critical one. You're accountable to the people. So I think that's the part we are trying to go initially, so that we restore integrity in Parliament. And I think Parliament is a great way to start. Because at the end of the day, policy decisions are made out of Parliament. Implementation is handed back to the civil servants to implement the political decisions made by politicians. It's only fair that our people, whether it's a budget, whether it's any appropriation whatsoever, our people must have confidence in our budget, in the way we appropriate public money. And also, I think the most important thing, Neville, is that our people must have confidence in the public officials that we appoint in line agencies of government. That's very important. Now, it's worse to think that you've got a hospital CEO. He may be an exceptional doctor, but if he's not a good manager, we will have problems. And I think once you have the oversight responsibility restored to where it's supposed to be, you start at Parliament, then it has a cascading effect right through the whole bureaucracy. And I think that's what the Special Parliamentary Committee is all about.
I'll ask you this question: why hasn't it been done before?
That's a $64 million question. I have no idea. But in my experience since 2002, when I was elected as member for Grok, I was quite fortunate, quite privileged to be appointed as Minister for Police, Internal Security, and also Minister for Justice. And I'll be frank with you, Neville, I've seen the systematic problems prevalent within the public service insofar as law enforcement is concerned. and as far as the entire criminal justice system is concerned. The big question for me, I take out with my time as minister is that our people hardly access justice, and that's been something that I've held for quite some time. It's quite obvious. You pay for justice in this country if you want justice. And how many people can afford justice? The affluent few can.
I was just about to ask you, it's safe to say that the ones with money and who are able to pay for justice get justice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That has been my view when I was Minister of Police. It saddens me that our people are, instead of the police becoming a friend in terms of upholding the rule of law, sometimes I think it's becoming the adversary. And our people, the greatest fear is the police. So we've got a long road ahead in terms of trying to institutionalize good governance, right from Parliament all the way to the state institutions concerned. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to our people after 39 years. And next year we'll be celebrating 40 years. It's incumbent on every member of Parliament and everyone who's in civil authority of high responsibility to really have a look at why you're there. As a member of Parliament, as a Chief Justice, as a Chief Magistrate, as a policeman, as a doctor, as a nurse, as an ambulance driver. Our people expect a lot from us, regardless of where we are in terms of the hierarchy. You may be way up there or you may be low down there, but the expectation is the same.
Now, you mentioned earlier about the size of our public sector, which is totally obese, if you could say. How do we trim the fat?
Well, to begin with, we have determined there are over 200 authorities, creatures of Parliament, creatures of NEC decisions, forming authorities here and there. There are a whole number of them. And they're still on the books. There's substantial expenditure being appropriated every year. But the big question is, what are they really doing that the departments are not doing already?
Could you give an example?
Well, for instance, if you look at the national drug, I forgot the actual name again. National drug something.
National Narcotics Bureau.
There you go. And if you look at the urbanization office, I mean, in a time like this, do you think that it's probably more relevant to park that under Department of Lands? So we can save a lot more bureaucratic costs. There's a layer of duplication going on. They're employing surveyors on the other side. Department of Lands got surveyors as well.
But who makes the decision on whether to set up an authority or not to?
Well, authorities are creatures of cabinet. It's the prevailing view at that time. If the cabinet decides that it's the most appropriate way to go, and the establishment of a number of authorities have come about because of the prevailing view at that time. But in terms of a cost-benefit analysis, if you look at it, we've got to ask big questions. It's no point having a surveyor and a fiscal planner on the other side, and have a surveyor and a fiscal planner, both doing the same thing, but on different payrolls, paid by the same taxpayer. That's something we need to ask questions, and we will be asking those big questions. Making those decisions, I think it falls within the ambit of NEC. They've got to make the decision themselves, because we report to Parliament. We call it as we see it. So there's a whole range of issues. I mean, we set up, look at the hospital authority, provincial hospital authority. So you've got a hospital management already in place, and then you've got a hospital board. And then you surround that board with doctors. We've got to ask the big question: what's the relevance of having that? What is the cost implication? Are we putting money, shifting money away from patients and putting it into the bureaucracy? These are critical questions. As young as we are, we ought to ask those big questions.